In 1851, London's Great Exhibition seemed the very symbol of European modernity and of expanding and triumphant industry and civilization. So after Britain avoided the turmoil, the revolutionary turmoil of 1848, unlike the rest of Europe, the exhibition represented stability amidst anarchy and productivity amidst destruction, the epitome of industry and what the Industrial Revolution had brought about. More significantly, it showed Britain to be one of the greatest European powers, exemplified in its imperial holdings and influence. And here you can see it as would be showcased later in Paris. So there were 13,000 exhibits from Britain, other European powers and their colonies. And in fact, it's the colonial holdings that were the most visited and popular. Most of these exhibits displaying machinery, manufactured goods, decorative household items, and the results of exploration and colonial plunder and conquest throughout the world. The exhibition was displayed in a huge modern glass and iron structure. And it was also known as the Crystal Palace, as you can see here. So imagine the grandiosity of this building, towering as visitors came through. It was 1,800 feet long and 400 feet wide, and it was tall enough to contain the elm trees growing at the site. So in addition to displaying British success and ingenuity, the exhibition offered a public space for people to display modern reason and respectability and live vicariously through the delights of empire. Needless to say, it was incredibly popular among Britons of all classes, and people came from all around the world to visit it. So the exhibit embodied European self-confidence in its industry, rationality, ingenuity, and national unity. And as such, was seen in Europe as representing the highest point yet reached by any civilization on Earth. Now, that point of view reflected a European one, to be sure. Now, the exhibit especially showed how imperialism was central to this and announced the ways in which Europe would, at the end of the 19th century, complete its conquest of the world economically, politically, and culturally. An enterprise which, although triumphant for Europeans, was fraught with anxieties. And these displays would become characteristic of a new phenomenon, the World Fair. And here is another example of a grandiose building that echoes the Crystal Palace, this time the Palace of Electricity at the Universal Exposition or World Fair in Paris in 1900. So while you have this display of confidence, reason, and ingenuity, the latter half of the 19th century, as your textbook explained, was increasingly concerned with issues of gender, race, and class, because it was concerned with the nature of European civilization, a concern that became even more urgent with the emergence of what historians call the new or high imperialism. And it is this high imperialism which provided the context for these anxieties. So why were they concerns? Why were they anxieties? Well, that has to do in part with the radical changes brought about by industry that changed everyday lives of Europeans, such as electricity, for instance, that changed the very rhythm of people's life. And especially because many of these changes affected women. Now, remember, there is the middle class ideal of domesticity that became dominant amongst the middle classes. And this ideal was a gendered ideology. On the one hand, there was the assumption that the public sphere was the field of masculine presence. It was characterized by worldliness, active business, and politics. And it was complemented by the private sphere, which was the realm of the feminine, characterized by virtue, passivity, the home, and family. And overall, within this complementary vision that is gendered of the ways in which middle class life should unfold, middle class believes that they upheld the principles and the values of work, responsibility, and domesticity. as well as restraint and reason, cleanliness and virtue, which they opposed to the working classes that they saw, perceived, and imagined to be undisciplined, unruly, driven by their passions, characterized by dirt and immorality. And that ideology was so powerful that, in fact, it became embraced by many across the classes. And here we have a photograph of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. And even though she is Queen Victoria and he is the prince, they are dressed in the characteristic fashion of the middle classes. Now, if we think of this ideal of domesticity, we have to realize that women, especially, and middle-class women, as you read in the primary document for last week, were charged to embody a certain sets of values and engage in a certain sets of duties and obligation. So middle class or bourgeois woman was to be the consoler and helpmate of her husband. She was to be the bearer of children. She was also to be a volunteer, intervening in society through charitable acts, the only acceptable and respectable mode in which women would bring the values of the private sphere into the public sphere. She was supposed to reject market values and the world beyond the protected haven of the home. But here comes a tension, a paradox, because at the same time, the bourgeois woman was supposed to be and was to become the leading consumer of industrial goods. And she expressed her class identity through fashion, behavior, taste, and home making. So all of this, in essence, was supported by some of the radical changes that took place in the 19th century, notably through the emergence of the department store. Now, today, we consider the department store that is to be found in a mall to be a very common, banal institution. However, this was newly founded and imagined in the 19th century. And here you have images of some of the most famous ones in London, such as Harrods. Harrods was built between 1894 and 1905. This was rather late because in fact, in Paris, the first department store, the Bon Marché, was built in 1838, while others were created in 1865 and 1869. Now, when department stores first started emerging in London, Paris, and other capital cities, their presence was not always seen with joy and warm welcome, but instead caused anxiety and resistance. And the historian Erica Rappaport argues that this reflected people's assumption and visions of the place of women in the public, the gendered vision of the economy, while also illustrating the changing cultural and social makeup of large cities, those bustling urban cities that you saw photographs of last week. Now think about this, because in essence, it speaks to our job as historian. Shopping is never just about shopping, but in fact reflects assumptions and anxieties regarding gender, consumerism, and class. So the department store was indeed new, and it was unique because it differed from previous small independent shopkeepers. What it did was radically different because now it combined different goods under one roof, from fashion to decorative products, food, and other miscellaneous shopping items. But it also involved extensive and elaborate dining facilities, reading and writing rooms, and other services. All of this in luxurious interiors. So department stores were not specialized retailers or stores as had existed before. They were usually located in elaborate buildings. In fact, in cities like Paris, as you can see from the photographs, there were great palaces devoted to consumerism with electricity, marble entrances, constructed almost like a cross between a museum and a concert hall. The stores in London were conceived in the spirit, and I quote, of London's emerging culture of spectacle and displays. And this was part of larger cultural developments. It is at the same moment that we see exhibitions, world fairs, arcades, dioramas, panoramas, bazaars, museums, all producing the Victorian public as a spectator. So why so many anxieties? Well, let me go over some of them. So the historian Rappaport shows that, in fact, some believe that department stores encourage a pathological form of consumerism. And by encouraging and welcoming a mixed crowd socially, economically, but also in terms of gender, it produced and disorganized gender, moral, and economic categories. Now, in fact, even if the female middle-class shopper had become a recognized sight and an expected one in department stores, selling conveniences to a crowd of primarily middle-class women was by no means an accepted idea, and it invoked fears of moral disorder, promiscuity, and lack of respectability. And remember, the word for a sex worker, for instance, was a public woman, showing again the assumptions that are made as to where middle-class women belonged. So this showed profound ambivalence around this new social figure of the bourgeois woman now entering and consuming in department stores. So these amenities facilitated women's presence in the cities, but at the same time raised fears about the morality of consumption and the class and gender relations within the shopping crowd. In fact, we can see this in particular events. So when Whitley, a businessman who decided to create a new department store, did so to great publicity, resentment and even riots erupted because he applied for a liquor license. Because in fact, the possibility, the very thought of ladies imbibing alcohol in public violated understandings of proper middle-class femininity. Remember the definition of gendered ideology of the separate spheres. It transformed shopping, an inherently female activity, from what was seen to be a healthy and profitable pleasure into a potentially socially and economically destructive activity. Because it was believed that with alcohol, female consumers would lose control and self-discipline, important middle-class values that also protected the virtue of these middle-class women. In short, it would transform respectable ladies into the other public women, the prostitutes. So in fact, in these debates, the figure of the sex worker loomed large because alcohol had always been associated with prostitutions. And in fact, in these years, the figure, and I quote, the figure of the prostitute represented the fate of the individual turned into a commodity by consumer society. It collapsed the distinction between a woman buying and a woman selling pleasure. It also figured large in anxieties over unmarried young middle-class girls wanting to dress like prostitutes and becoming morally tainted, especially as your textbook explains, you have new professions emerging that are primarily occupied by women. So in fact, here, the prostitute became the specter of a destructive femininity in that respect. So there is a way in which what could be celebrated and embraced also cause incredible fear. But there are other seemingly banal, or that to us seem banal and normal inventions and innovations that cause gendered anxieties. And one was the bicycle, which also evoked figures, the specter of the sex worker, as was painted regularly in 19th century paintings. Here you see from Toulouse-Lautrec in 1894, who went to a brothel and made prostitutes a figure of all of his paintings. Here, a woman pulling up her stocking. And how do we know those would be nude? Those are sex workers and not just prostitutes. It is because in these paintings, there would be a particular code. So for instance, if you look at this painting by Manet, which caused an incredible scandal, as well as this one, the nude, the classical nude, the Greek nude is always fully naked. So the very fact that these women would not be aestheticized and would stand there with clearly visible makeup, and the remnants of clothes would be a code for signifying sex work, as this painting called the Olympia, which caused a huge scandal in France, so much so that it had to be hung higher, because otherwise people tried to deface it. Because here the suggestion is that this is a woman engaging in sex work. You can tell it from her jewelry and her flower, the fact that she is reclining seemingly before or after a client's visit, who may have sent flowers, as is indicated by the maid coming to see her. And here again, we see an echo of the argument made in the first lecture on Beyoncé's European history, which is the ways in which Blackness exists as an echo of slavery and in the margins of paintings. And what also made this scandalous was Manet's own techniques. So the very flat way of painting, and the fact that, unlike the previous one, as you can see here, Olympia is looking back directly at the public. So all of this is at stake in what emerges that is new and that is embraced. So here is the bicycle, and the bicycle caused a scandal and was in fact very controversial. So in fact, it was controversial because there were those who supported it, embraced it, and those who were in favor of it. Now, in fact, doctors encouraged the use of the bicycle because it emphasized mobility. And what we have is a medicalized discourse that encourages women's health and women's bodies for the purpose of being able to produce healthy children for the nation and for the empire. So bicycle attracted both conservative doctors and feminists because it offered new freedoms. And while it offered freedoms, it became the target of conservative attacks. So on the one hand, if you look at the image to the left, what do we see? We see a woman riding in a bicycle. So why would that be attractive? You are in nature. This is a leisure activity. You're able to enjoy nature, which might be a respite after living in bustling cities. You are also there engaging in physical exercises, which promotes health and a good hygiene, sort of strength, and therefore makes women more fit for motherhood. And for women who are now entering the professions and middle classes, and for feminists or suffragettes, it is also a symbol of new freedom. On the other hand, the opponents to the bicycle were deeply worried that the bicycle, in fact, offered too many freedoms. Remember the anxiety about middle-class women being in public unaccompanied, as we saw with a department store, and this is exactly what this image evokes, but also the belief that riding a bicycle would ruin women's sexual health and compromise proper femininity. Why? Well, because if you look at the image, unlike horse riding, where women would ride both of their legs to the side, the bicycle meant that women would ride astride a bicycle seat. And the belief was that this would promote unexpected masturbation, and that in turn would endanger women's sexual health. And this led to the creation of new types of bicycle seats in order to reassure those who worried about the bicycle. So if you look at the right, you see how, in fact, that becomes the argument made. The pneumatic bicycle saddle. And if you read here, you can see, let me return this, how it is easy for ladies because it becomes easy to sit on, comfortable, wide and flat in the back. All injurious pressure absolutely avoided. And these were real concerns from doctors, from critics, etc. So what we have here is an intense debate over this innovation that is the bicycle. Now, again, what we see is advertisers, in an effort to promote the use of the bicycle, then trying to address these criticisms. So on the left, you can see another advert which promotes Columbia bicycle and how these are best for ladies' safety. And the ad reads, "We have aimed to make it light, strong, and easy riding. And it is fitted with cushion or pneumatic tires." And here the language is also interesting. "The pneumatic tire absorbs vibration and makes riding on any surface pleasant and agreeable. The handlebar allows the rider to assume a natural and graceful position." And the ad reassures that this bicycle will not endanger proper femininity and women's sexual health, while the advertisement on the right reassures that it is indeed a respectable activity that promotes motherhood and family life. Because in this particular advert, what we see is the evocation of the family, with the husband at the back riding and the mother this time not riding, but teaching her young child how to ride. So why is this interesting? Well, because we see two phenomena here. We see how women's status, health, was of utmost importance because women were considered the markers of civilization. And there is indeed an increasing interest that emerges in the health and fitness of a nation and therefore of its citizens. And it is in this particular context that the Olympic Games, which were originally Greek, were restored and were brought up again. And your textbook discusses this. In fact, they were revived in Athens in 1896, and sponsors intended to highlight international cooperation and to mute increasingly militaristic nationalism. Critics judged the physical competition among national teams to be a less lethal form of warfare, an ersatz of warfare, but a preparation for war nonetheless. So what does this have to do with imperialism or race? Well, that will be the topic of the second part to this lecture.